And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Mike and Dawn, or Dawn and Mike, or whatever we want to. We got to come up with a name for this, Mike.
I know.
Something really catchy, what have you. Uh, anyway, Mike and I, this will be our third video in response to Doug Wilson, who recently has made two videos attacking the full preterist view, i.e., covenant eschatology. And by the way, folks, I know Mike feels the same way. I just want to give a great big thank you to all of those who have been watching the videos. I noticed this morning at about 3:30, our first video has been viewed right at almost 1,300 times.
Nice.
And so we're really, really appreciative of that. I I don't remember what the second video the views on that are, but it has climbed on up there. If seemed like it was already up over maybe 800 or something like that. So, very, very pleased at the interest that you folks out there are showing in these videos, expressing appreciation that somebody needed to address Doug Wilson and some of these other people. And so, to be honest about it, Mike and I are just having a lot of fun doing this.
Absolutely.
It's just
Absolutely.
it's enjoyable. Okay, what we want to do this evening, ladies and gentlemen, is Mike and I want to touch on some of the key eschatological passages that Doug brought forth in his very first video, in which he presented 10 points against covenant eschatology. Mike has a full list of those. We're not going to try to cover every single text. My personal position is, if we can cover the major text that he adduces, then we have thereby covered the other passages that he mentions. Once you've proven that the major passages, I mean, like Romans 8, which we're going to talk about first. Once you have proven that Romans chapter 8 is not talking about some future end of time, earth burning, time consuming resurrection, where all the bodies of all the dead come out of the graves. Once you prove that, guess what? You've proven that 1 Corinthians 15 is not about that either. Because all of these men who signed that declaration, I don't know, there might be a couple of exceptions to that, but nonetheless, the huge majority of the men who signed the letter condemning Gary DeMar and full preterism would agree with that principle. Don't you think so, Mike?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't know, to be honest with you, I told Mike earlier in the day, well, let's cover, let me see, what did I say? Yeah, let's
Romans
cover,
8,
let's
2 Corinthians
Romans 8, 2
5,
Corinthians 5,
1 Corinthians 15,
and Philippians 3.
Philippians 3.
And the more I thought about it, I said, that ain't happening.
We can
uh,
sure try.
yeah, but we're going to get into Romans chapter 8. And needless to say, ladies and gentlemen, Romans chapter 8 is in fact considered to be one of the most foundational eschatological texts, one of the most definitive in all of the New Testament. And Mike, I don't know if you've ever heard me share the story or not, but years and years and years ago, when I was still living in Shawnee, Oklahoma, preaching up there, I decided that I had to write a book as much for myself as for somebody else to read, proving that the New Testament really does teach a yet future coming of the Lord. Because I was losing passage after passage after passage,
Right.
to AD 70. And I was like, man, I've got to put a stop to this. And the passage that I chose was Romans chapter 8, because I was 100% convinced at the time it's definitely an end of time event. And so, boy, here I go. I'm just writing and writing and writing. I found the manuscript that I had done up there, at where I got to a certain point and I stopped.
Uh-oh.
Because here came that proverbial train, And I'll be really honest, I got a little scared. I was like, Don, if Romans 8 is not end of time, neither are the following text.
Correct.
And that means you're going to lose your job. So for over a year, Mike, I struggled so mightily with myself. But finally, I just got to the point I couldn't look myself in the mirror anymore. I just simply could not look myself in the mirror and say, all right, Preston, you tried to prove an end of the world from this text, and it didn't work. You've got to face it. You've got to deal with it. I just could not then, cannot now teach and proclaim something that I don't believe to be the truth. It goes against the grain. It goes against the conscience. And if there was ever one thing that my father, the legacy that he left with me, it was, you stand on what you believe.
Right.
You don't teach what anybody else says, because that's the church's position. You make up your own mind. You take your own stand on what you believe by the Bible to be true. And so I dug back into Romans chapter 8, but I never finished the manuscript. I just thought, you know what? It's good enough. I'm now convinced it's not futures, it's AD 70. So I'm just going to move on. So that's what I did. But Romans 8 gave me absolute fits.
Yeah. And I think we can kind of see this in Gary DeMar, and then in his podcast with Kim Burgess, where, in Last Days Madness, Gary says, this glory was about to take place. I don't know what the glory is, but it was about to be. And that was kind of about the extent that he wanted to go with that. But yet then, when he's interviewing Kim goes all the way with it, and then would understand it the same way we do, except he takes the glory that would be revealed in the church as the Holy Spirit. I don't know where he came up with that, but we can talk about that in a little bit. But you're right. Once this one goes, because it's the resurrection, it's the redemption of the body.
Correct.
So not only is there no more end of time and no more, physical new creation, there's the resurrection. That they're both connected. And so once this is gone, they're all gone. And that's why I was a little disappointed in Doug Wilson. Not only was there no attempts to deal with the 3 time texts, there was no attempt to say, hey, look, there are some Reformed theologians like John Lightfoot, which all these partial preterists are building upon. They're all building upon John Lightfoot. All right. They're standing on his shoulders. So you would think, and I know Gentry has said that Lightfoot is like one of his favorite theologians. You would think that these guys would mention John Lightfoot as saying, hey, he didn't talk about the imminent time statements, but he was really clear on what the vanity and what the corruption, what the decay was, and what this creation is. And it's not the physical creation. And so these are the kind of, I don't want to say dishonest, because, you never know if someone doesn't have enough time or whatever. But, if you're going to deal with it thoroughly and, historically, you need to address these particular issues.
100% correct. And especially if you are going to attack the standing of another believer. If you're going to attack, for instance, the preterist movement based upon Romans chapter 8, then it would certainly behoove you to have all of your ducks in a row on Romans chapter 8. It's not enough to say preterism violates the church's historical stand on Romans chapter 8. Exactly what does that prove? Well, it proves that a lot of other men, good men, men who are struggling, but let's face it, as Kenneth Gentry observed on the book of Revelation, the reason that he rejects the Westminster Confession of Faith eschatology on the book of Revelation is because that was created at a time of controversy. It was not created out of careful exegesis, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I happen to agree with that. 100%. I agree with Gentry's analysis of that. But you could also say the same thing for an awful lot of these other texts, that they were born out of presuppositional hermeneutics, and they were not born or drawn out from careful exegesis, and this is so commonplace. It's really interesting to me. N.T. Wright is currently having a profound influence on ministers in the churches of Christ, for instance. In the churches of Christ, Romans chapter 8 has historically been almost a bugaboo. You don't talk about that passage, because I may not know what it means. I just know that it's not what the postmillennialists say it is. I may not know what it really teaches, but it's not what dispensationalists say it is.
Are you talking about Romans 11 or Romans 8?
Romans 8.
Oh, Romans 8. Oh, okay.
Yeah. N.T. Wright takes what can be considered even the traditional postmillennial view, that is, of a recreated earth, a renovated earth. As N.T. Wright expressed it at one time, in sometime in our future, the myrtle tree and the rose bushes and all that will be renewed and bring forth greater glory. Well, it blew my mind to find out that view is gaining traction in the churches of Christ. That has never, ever been widely accepted. The traditional view in the churches of Christ is that at the end of time, the earth and the elements that are therein are completely incinerated. They're not here anymore. And so when the question is asked, well, okay, if the earth is completely incinerated right down to the atomic level, then what is the new heaven and new earth? Oh, well, that's just metaphoric language for heaven. So they shift shift hermeneutic right in, dead smack middle of their interpretation of the text.
Wow.
But now there's a shift. I don't even know how much of a shift it is, but I do know I've been witnessing this on an increasing level of some fairly prominent members of the churches of Christ now taking N.T. Wright's view of a redeemed, restored physical creation. So that obviously is Doug Wilson's position. That would be the position, it certainly is, of Kenneth Gentry and the majority of the signers of the letter. So why don't we take a look at Romans chapter 8? Now, Mike, you mentioned that there are 3 time statements there. I'm going to differ with that. I'm going to say that there are 4, at least.
Oh, cool.
4. And here's what happens. This is
the appointed time. Is that the 4th?
Well, no, that's another. Okay. That's another one.
Okay.
Yeah. What I have found so interesting is in the sermons and in the homiletic developments of Romans chapter 8. Everyone starts Romans chapter 8:18. I consider that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us. Boy, some years ago, right here in Ardmore, in the midst of the controversy over my teaching covenant eschatology, a very, very prominent Church of Christ preacher came to town to hold a gospel meeting. And I got a call from one of the members from that congregation asking me to attend a Bible class that the guy was going to hold on one morning. I was like, sure. I had known the guy, never well. We were never friends, but he and I had met, on several occasions. So I thought, well, sure, I'd be glad to see him again. His subject was Romans chapter 8. And he took this renovated earth view, which blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. He started with Romans 8:18. I reckon that the sufferings of this present time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we all know what it's like to hear the news that we've got cancer, or that we've got heart trouble, or we all know what it's like to lose everything that we have financially. He said, but Paul says, this suffering that we experience at times like that is nothing to be compared with the glory that we'll have in heaven. And I sat there and I thought, well, okay, typical Church Christ preacher who doesn't know up from down when it comes to eschatology. And I'm not trying to be overly harsh, overly critical. It's just the way it is. Paul is not talking about, as I have expressed it like this over the years, Paul's not talking about cancer, heart attack, financial trouble, or even teenage kids.
And that's bad.
That is really, really bad. Sometimes worse than others. But anyway, Paul has a very specific kind of suffering. And this is where I find N.T. Wright a little bit ambiguous. He understands that the previous verses is talking about something very specific, very time restricted. But then he jumps ship and talks about just the labors of the Christian life, of, throughout the entirety of the Christian age, of enduring persecution. That's not what Paul's talking about. But everyone wants to start at Romans 8:18, and that's a mistake. Let's start for time consideration. The Spirit itself, verse 16, excuse me. The Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. I want everyone to pay particular attention to the very last part, very last half of this verse. If indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified with him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the word suffer there is from the Greek word pathemata, sufferings. And then he's going to use a different word down in the text, and that's the word thlipsis. Okay. This is where Doug Wilson didn't touch it. And as you and I both know, he didn't develop this text in depth at all. He gave it a broad brush. Yeah. Mention.
He didn't give an exegesis of any text.
Of any text. You're exactly right. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a theme. Can you hear that airplane?
Yeah.
Okay. It felt like he was buzzing my office. But anyway, there is a motif here known as the sufferings of Christ. It is found throughout the Pauline literature. It is found in the Petrine literature, 1 Peter chapter 5. And scholars have long recognized that the motif here is that Christ had a measure of suffering to endure, and his body, the church, had a measure of suffering to endure to fill up its measure of suffering. And when the sufferings of Christ were completed, Christ would come. We find this in Paul, Colossians chapter 1, 24 and following. And now I rejoice in my sufferings in the flesh for you, that I might fill up what is lacking in the afflictions, Greek word thlipsis, what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. And I mean to tell you, this has bothered commentators for centuries. What do you mean fill up that which is lacking in the suffering of Christ? Jesus didn't suffer enough? Well, measure of suffering, measure of suffering. And what's really fascinating about Colossians 1 is that Paul writes in the emphatic mode in the Greek, in which he is essentially saying, I am personally bringing the sufferings of Christ to its climax through my own personal suffering. That wasn't negating the importance of other Christians' suffering. It was simply to say Paul played a distinctive role in filling up the measure of that suffering. N.T. Wright doesn't touch the relationship between Romans 8:17 and verse 18 and following. Verse 17, right. He acknowledges, the sufferings of Christ, the sufferings of Christ. Major theme in Paul. Okay, that's great. And then it comes to verse 18 and following, and it kind of goes off on this more generic, Christians are going to suffer during the entirety of the Christian age.
Yeah, he just kind of goes with the flow. You can always tell these guys will do great exegesis, and they come to a passage like this, and they just start regurgitating what everyone else has said and what what they know everyone wants to hear, and they don't do any exegesis. They're not looking at the different Greek words. They're not looking at how the Jews understood it. And, with that, filling up the measure would be, the martyr vindication.
Absolutely.
Motif. And they all go hand in hand. So, yeah. And when Gary says, in his book, he's not quite sure what the glory is that was about to be revealed, the verse right before it, it's the glorification of the body of Christ, that we would be glorified with him. And of course, that's the new covenant glory.
Absolutely. That brings up a second motif that is to be found here in verses 17, and then through the entirety, the rest of the text here of Romans 8:18 and following. When I very first read about this motif, Mike, I was literally stunned. I mean, you know how excited we get when we grab a hold of something that we've never really grasped before, and it starts unfolding in passage after passage after passage.
Right.
That's what happened to me when I first heard of what I'm about to share, because it was like, uh-oh, wow, here we go. and the passages just started parading through my mind,
Lining up. Yeah.
lining up one after another. And here's the motif. And by the way, folks, if you want to do your own research on this, just get on Google and just look up shame versus glory in the New Testament, or glory versus shame. Just doesn't matter. Just look it up. You will find lecture after lecture after lecture. Now, unfortunately, some of them, they give you a really good taste of this professor at wherever. And about the point that he's really starting to adduce all of these Bible verses where this pattern is found, it says, now, if you want to listen to the rest of this lecture,
right. I know. I hate those.
Send in your $9.95.
Right. A month.
A month. Yeah. And you're like, oh, but nonetheless, you'll get enough of a flavor of it. Here's what the shame versus glory motif is. And look, folks, this is found in the Tanakh over and over and over and over. It's found in Isaiah 63. The Lord says, for instance, in Isaiah 63, I'm going to turn your shame into glory. Well, hello. This is an ancient Near East motif. And essentially what it means is this. If any person or if any group of people were declared to be persona non grata, if they were declared to be unclean, if they were declared to be sinners, vile, social outcasts, that was shame. And oh, by the way, if you are one of that class of people, you were also considered to be dead. John Levinson, in his book on the resurrection in Israel, points out that in the Hebraic worldview, there were all sorts of death. And the Western world, we think, well, death, we know what death is. That's somebody kicks the bucket. But he said in the ancient Near East, in Hebraic thought, if somebody has terminal cancer, but they're still alive, no, they're dead. They were dead. If somebody suffered irreversible financial ruin, guess what? They were dead. As he points out, they're just a wide range, an entire spectrum of things that were labeled as death. Well, that's not the way we think today. But in each one of those categories, you can see the shame that is linked to it. For instance, if you had been a senator in a far-off country, the Romans came, they conquered your country. It didn't matter if you're a senator. It doesn't matter if you're a philosopher. It didn't matter what you were. Now you're a slave. And all you are is a, quote, body, unquote. And you're dead because you don't have any rights. So all of these different spectrums of honor or versus shame. Okay. So if you were one of those groups that is being ostracized, and to be particularly relevant to Romans chapter 8, if you're part of a group that is being persecuted, you know, suffering with Christ, that's shame. But you've already called attention to it. What's Paul promising? We reckon that the sufferings of this present time, well, that suffering was of the church, the body of Christ, that was the object of ostracism and hatred. You know, this was only written, 57? This is only written about 7 or 8 years before the Neronian persecution of the church in Rome. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, talking about how the Christians got blamed for that. And he said they're worthy to be blamed because they're just an abomination of all men. They're hated of all men. Well, here's that shame concept. However, if something happens, and you see this, by the way, lots and lots of times in Roman history, you will find a Roman legion losing its banner. Well, that was the ultimate shame. And they would go to any length whatsoever to gain that banner back. And if they did, it's like being raised from the dead. It's being restored to glory. That's how they viewed that eagle on the staff and what have you. So this whole concept of shame versus glory, it is in fact a resurrection motif. And I can tell you, Mike, this is an area I have developed it in some of my writings, such as We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings, and Daniel, the Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12. But this is an area, this is a subject that is not being explored nearly enough in the preterist community as a whole. This is a subject that is generally reserved for the scholarly circles. Well, it's time we take that truth that they are talking about and we start seeing how it applies to all of these New Testament passages that we have never viewed within the context of the shame versus glory. And it's not talking about physical death versus physical resurrection. You know, Peter said he was a partaker of the sufferings of Christ with his fellow believers there in Asia. And he said, and a partaker of the glory that is about to be revealed. Well, he's echoing Romans 8, or saying the same thing at least. And it's shame versus glory.
Nice.
So when Doug Wilson doesn't even give this motif, which is, I want to suggest, now, if somebody wants to challenge that, that's just fine. But when the reversal of roles, the reversal of condition, the reversal of status permeates Romans chapter 8, then we at least have to consider that shame versus glory motif is very, very much at work. And what that means is Paul's probably not talking about biological death or biological resurrection when he talks about the redemption of the body. He's talking about the body as a corporate group being vindicated from its shame, glorified, because again, in the ancient Near East, and by the way, this motif is still present among the Japanese, among many of the Semites, in the over in the Oriental countries. It's not like this idea has passed away. That's why in Japan, by the way, I was reading an article just this week, some head politician of some massive company that had lost billions and billions and billions of dollars under his leadership. Guess what he did? Killed himself. Why? To recover his name.
Right.
So I took a lot of time throwing that out there on the table, but I really believe this is so critically important for us to consider when we come to Romans chapter 8. Now, go ahead and pick up on some things, and you talk for a while.
Okay. Well, as preterists, we like to throw out that phrase, well, what time is it? And he tells us right away, right? Consider that the suffering of this present time, or the Greek here is Kairos. Kairos. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's Kairos or Kairos, but it's a divinely appointed time. It's the time when all things come to a consummation or a crisis. And it's used by Paul in several different places connected with time texts. But we talked about this before. Daniel chapter 12, in the old Greek Septuagint of verse 4, it's the hour of the end. And Don and I already talked about John chapter 4 and John chapter 5 with the resurrection there of the already and not yet. But also in the Septuagint, a different Septuagint, it is the appointed time of the end, or it is the decreed time of the end. And I found two different translations that translate it that way. There's a Catholic translation and then Wycliffe, as you pointed out. So this is a very specific time that Paul is looking at. And when we look at Paul elsewhere, and if we just stayed here in Romans, we go to Romans 13, verses 11 and 12, where the day is far spent, the day of the new covenant is at hand. But again, it is the appointed time that he is talking about. And it all goes back to Daniel chapter 12. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we have this, again, appointed time. He says the appointed time was short. And that's why he told them not to get married, or at least it's not a good idea. It's not a good time to get married because of what Don just talked about, this persecution that was taking place probably under Nero. I can't remember when Corinthians is written, but no, before. Now, in your debate, Mark Smith threw out 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and says, well, wait a second. This is, some 900 miles away from Jerusalem. And he just had no concept that the Romans were persecuting Jews throughout the Roman Empire. And it was kind of like you said, they were shamed. And so Paul is saying the appointed time is short. And here we have, 3 different time texts connected to this appointed time. It's not chronos. It's not, chronological general time. It's a very specific eschatological time that Paul has in mind here.
Absolutely. I would differ with one thing. I don't believe it was the Romans persecuting the Corinthians at all. This is 55 to 57, maybe as late as 58.
Okay. So
the church was established in the synagogue.
Yes.
There, and it was from the synagogue that the persecution arose. And I think there's several factors that run into that. Matter of fact, in Acts chapter 18, what happens? Well, the Jews brought Paul in front of the Roman judge, and when the Roman judge discovered this was an intramural fight among the Jews, you're a heretic. No, we're preaching the Messiah promised in our scriptures. He had the Jews beaten like, don't bother me with your religious infighting. So the Romans weren't even concerned with persecuting the church at that particular time. They were more than happy to let the Jews fight it out among themselves because they perceived that's what that was. But I think we said on the first program, it might have been the last one, Mike. You did a great job pointing out these different verses that contain it. That word Kairos is so incredibly important. I mean, when people want to talk about, well, God can't tell time. God doesn't talk about time like we do. Then they have to completely and totally ignore the biblical, and I'm talking about in the Tanakh as well as in the New Testament, the use of Kairos. obviously the Septuagint, the Greek of the Old Testament. But that word is not vague, it's not generic. It means a time was set by God. A time was, I love Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined
for your people and city.
For your people in your city. Well, that word decreed is katak, if I remember correctly, and it literally means cut out. So what Daniel was being told was here's the stream of time that Yahweh in his sovereignty was able to view as a steady stream of time. So God goes, okay, from here to here. That is my decree. The following things are going to take place during this 70-week period of time. That is the Kairos.
Yes. Let me just jump in real quick.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I challenged Rabbi Tovia Singer to debate. Couldn't get a proposition narrow enough. But now we're trying to get one set up with Don to debate him, because on Myth Vision, I saw Rabbi Tovia Singer on there, totally mocking Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, your first skeptic didn't want to deal with the Old Testament. So now we can find another skeptic that thinks the Old Testament's his bag. And, you know, Don, when you talk about Daniel 9 and you talk about the 70 weeks, not only did the Jews understand that to be a messianic passage, but they understood, and we had the rabbis saying it, if Messiah didn't come during the destruction of the temple, he will never come. Or will he ever come? Yeah. Why? Because they understood this was a set time. This was a decreed time. You know, if you want to be an open theist and just say, you know, every generation has the possibility of Messiah coming and all this, then they have an excuse that he'll never come.
Right.
So this was a very specific decreed time. So if he didn't come in AD 70 in that second temple, Malachi 3 and 4, and he didn't come upon the clouds in judgment to burn that temple, then you've got no Messiah.
That's right. That is absolutely right. That's excellent observations. And, you know, there was another rabbinic saying, I've forgotten the name of the rabbi at this particular point, but that particular rabbi said, woe is unto us, for the time, for the coming of the Messiah has come and gone, and he has not come. We're without hope. Well, what was he talking about? The time, AD 70. I mean, it's amazing to me how we can find statements like this that are so powerful in showing that there was knowledge. And look, this may be subtle, but it's still nonetheless to the point. In John chapter 1, here's John the Baptizer out there baptizing, right? Well, the Pharisees, Sadducees, they send out an embassage to go out to talk to him, and they say, are you the one that we are looking for? Well, that's from the Greek word prostakao. Prostakao is an eager, expectant looking. Well, if they didn't have a sense that the time, the appointed time, was near, then why would they say, we are eagerly we think you're the dude because the time has come?
Well, it goes back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. It goes back to 11Q Melchizedek, where the Jews, and even Gary DeMar in one of his articles pointed out that the Jews separated their time, their redemptive times, by periods of jubilees.
Yes. And
so when they were reading Daniel's 77s, they started it with the destruction of the first temple, included that 70 years that Jeremiah talks about within the 490 years. And when they used their calendar, which is about 160-year difference between the Gentile calendar, yep, they believed Messiah was going to come in that 10th Jubilee.
Yep.
And so Margaret Barker in her article on the Jubilee does a great job of doing
it.
She points out, because of this, and when you calculate the Jubilees from 420 to AD 70, that's 490 years, okay? They were expecting Messiah. right around this time. So yeah, that dovetails perfectly with what you're talking about.
Exactly right. And we should point out that in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus stood up in the synagogue of Capernaum,
That's
and he
beautiful.
read from Isaiah chapter 62, Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me with the Spirit to preach glad tidings of good things, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Well, what was the acceptable year of the Lord in Jewish terminology, theology, etc.? It was the year of Jubilee.
Yeah.
Many scholars, Margaret Barker, in the article that you just mentioned and alluded to, points out there's really good, strong evidence for believing that Jesus was saying, guys, it's the it's the time of the 10th Jubilee.
Yeah.
The time for the kingdom has come.
And she
And
points out in that article that the Jews didn't know how to calculate. They didn't know if they should do it by 49 years or 50 years.
right.
And she said they some of them start at 422, some at 424. But I did, now she gets her calculations from 49. So I did it by 50. And when I did it, the 10th Jubilee began anywhere between 8026 to 8028. So here's Jesus. And as you pointed out in some of your other stuff, the Gospel of John is broken down in feasts. And so all these feasts correspond. Jesus always uses the feast to say, I am this, I'm the fulfillment of the feast. So, I mean, when he opens up Isaiah 61 and he says the Jubilee is
61.
here,
Yeah.
I really believe literally that the 10th Jubilee started right then, because, that was my calculations that I got. So I just think that's awesome. I wish I could have been there when he opened that up.
Oh, yeah. When he said this day is this scripture fulfilled in your eyes, there must have been a shockwave going through that synagogue, because how many times in all of their readings had somebody stood up and said, well, the Lord, Messiah will come. The Messiah will come one of these days. May the God of Israel bless us with Messiah to proclaim the true Jubilee. And then this dude from up the road at Nazareth, this little village up there, he stands up and says, it's here.
Yeah. And it corresponds well with what you say in the 77s there in Daniel 9 with the feast days.
Oh, yeah.
And that there's really not a gap. You've got to get your mind away from this gap. Like, oh, well, the dispensationalists have this thousands of years. Yeah. Now we have a problem with the 40-year. No, it's a process. It's a fulfilling of the year, the festival year of Israel. Now, the Jew believed, according to 11Q Melchizedek, they believed that the Messiah had 49 to 50 years to accomplish all of redemption.
Yep.
And so you have 3.5 years after the first 3.5 years, that 7, where Messiah is cut off. And then you have another 3.5 years of the war. All right. When the power of the holy people is completely shattered, Daniel 12 will pick that back up. And so it's a process within that generation. You have all these motifs. You have the second Exodus taking place during this generation. You have the 10th Jubilee, but he has to fulfill everything. He has to judge the watchers and Satan. He has to bring redemption to Israel. He has to do all of that. And scripture is clear that he did fulfill all of those things.
Absolutely. I mean, that's fantastic. And I was getting ready to jump in there with the second Exodus motifs because, I mean, you and I both feel so strongly and understand so well, and I know William Bell and I have talked about this countless hours, about how powerfully the second Exodus motif runs throughout the entire ministry of Jesus, all the way through the book of Revelation. And by the way, there are some pretty noted scholars that see Romans chapter 8. I believe Perriman is one of them, or it may be Tom Holland, pardon me, who see the Exodus motif also at work right here in Romans chapter 8.
Yes.
The suffering of this present time. That's
Right. Yeah.
yeah, that's captivity. That's Egyptian captivity. But guess what? We're about to be released. Why? Well, because the second Moses has come and he's going to deliver us and he's going to take us into the promised land. So
The groanings under Egyptian bondage
the
and the
groanings
salvation.
under Egyptian bondage, those are all Exodus motifs. And, you know,
Yes, our good friend Bob Cruikshank sent me that.
oh,
It was in NT Wright. And of course, you know me, I have to make a chart out of it.
yeah.
So, I did a great chart comparing the two. But just real quick, I didn't get a chance to cover this. Kairos is first started with Jesus's teaching. Well, Daniel, but then Jesus in Luke 21, verse 8, and then 27 and 28. He says, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the appointed time, that is of redemption, is at hand." He says, "Do not go after them." Why, Jesus? Because the gospel must first be preached to all nations and to the whole creation. Now, that's important because we have the appointed time connected to the preaching of all creation, Don. I kind of see a train coming there in Romans chapter 8. And again, I've got a chart comparing the Olivet Discourse with Romans 8, and it's beautiful.
Oh, it's
Paul's
beautiful.
eschatology is Jesus' eschatology.
No, there's no question whatsoever about it. And, and well, we've gotten a long way, haven't we?
Yeah.
In our discussion of Romans 8 in light of Doug Wilson. So let's get back to it because, boy, we could just keep on going with that beautiful stuff. I mean, it really is gorgeous. And I just remember so well, not only then, but even to this present day, as I have dug into these passages that once used to just give me absolute total fits because I could not get a handle on them. But to find the keys, as it were, to unlocking the significance of these passages, and then to experience the frustration of reading men such as N.T. Wright, that they walk right up to the edge. They walk right up to the edge of what it meant to those people living at that time. N.T. Wright does a fantastic job of pointing out the contrast between the times past. The time past. God was patient. Romans chapter 3, 24 and following. He overlooked the sins. But now, at the proper time, he sent his son to die for us. That's, at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Just the right Kairos. Back to the significance of that. So here is men like N.T. Wright that bring us right up to the point and says, look, in the Old Testament time, God overlooked sin, didn't hold them accountable. There was no provision, but now God has set forth his son to be the propitiation for our sin. Then versus now. And he points out the significance of the now time in Pauline literature. Well, okay, if you're going to point out the then versus now time in Pauline literature, then why not follow through with it in Romans 8, 18 and following?
If there was only one appointed time for the Messiah to come into the world, and there couldn't be any other time, and then we only have one eschatological appointed time for the coming of the Lord, the judgment and resurrection of the dead, this again is a serious problem for Doug Wilson and the partial preterist, because Paul specifically says that appointed time was short and it was about to be fulfilled.
Yeah. I think without doubt, we're safe to say that so many of these men have struggled with their eschatology. I can't help but feel that many of them have struggled privately with their own eschatology, but they're so bound up with this futurist concept. And it all goes back to the nature of the death of Adam, obviously. They believe physical death is the death of Adam. Death of Adam's got to be overcome. Therefore, physical death has got to be overcome. Well, okay. So you have men that have changed their view on the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12. It used to be physical resurrection. Now it's the corporate body of Israel experiencing spiritual resurrection in Jesus, in the body of Christ. Well, thank you, Kenneth Gentry. We appreciate that support because, hello, no problem with that. They see the significance to a great extent of AD 70. How many of the men on that list, Mike? I don't know so many of the men. I don't know nearly as many of them as you do, but so many of the men, nonetheless, they agree. The abomination of desolation, first century, right?
Yep.
Great tribulation, first century, right?
Yep.
John as Elijah, first century, right?
Absolutely.
Gospel preached into all the world as a witness to the nations.
And then the end, but then Gentry says that's not the end of the age that the disciples asked about.
Right, exactly. I know. I know. So, in fact, in my book on Daniel chapter 12, the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, I have a long list of the major constituent elements of eschatology, of the end times, that postmillennialists particularly, and many, many amillennial, reformed amillennialists would agree and do agree, oh yeah, these all took place in the first century prior to AD 70 when the Lord came spiritually in judgment, in a historical judgment.
You want me to add a couple more real quick?
Go right ahead.
The parousia of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 23 was fulfilled in AD 70. That was Philip Kaiser.
And Scott Bull, if I remember correctly.
Mike Bull.
Mike Bull, I'm sorry.
The coming of Christ in 1 Thessalonians 4, parousia there, was fulfilled in AD 70. I mean, right there, the farm is, it's gone. Now, he gets away with it, even though everyone else considers him, oh man, you know, that we don't agree with that, but he gets away with it because he says, well, it was a physical resurrection. And then he tries to do this dichotomy between multiple harvests, different kind of harvest, and just kind of crazy stuff. But these guys, and he even takes Mello here in Romans 8 as AD 70.
I read that just recently. Yeah.
But he doesn't really develop it. So these guys are giving the farm away, and yet they're trying to crucify Damar. It's just it's really mind-boggling. But
well, I agree 100% with that. So here's what they do with all of these constituent elements of eschatology that they admit and affirm, strongly affirm in their writings. Those things happened in the first century. Let me see. I believe that it was Matheson who said, no, I'm sorry, it was Jordan. James Jordan said, the evidence is abundant, it is clear. The Great Tribulation, or the abomination of desolation, excuse me, occurred in the first century, and it is abhorrent to suggest that there is another one yet to come.
Right.
Okay. I agree with that. And so many of these other men would do that as well. Matter of fact, I posed a question in a really, really short exchange with one of the men on that letter. Not long ago, they didn't stay around for me to engage any further in the discussion. Was the abomination of desolation of the first century typological of another yet future abomination of desolation? Oh, no. Okay, was the appearance of John as Elijah typological of another yet future coming of another prophet who will be Elijah, or maybe even the real Elijah? Oh, absolutely not. No, we have no authority to say that. By the way, Kenneth Gentry agrees with all this.
I know.
Yeah, he does not see a future abomination. He does not see a future great tribulation. He does not see yet future Elijah. I mean, it's on and on.
In his book published by IVP, I can't remember if it's the Book of Revelation, 4 Views. I think it's that one, where he's debating an amillennialist, a premillennialist. And when these guys want to start double fulfilling things, or the amillennialist wants to stretch out the tribulation for, the whole interim period, he goes, oh no, this is a specific 80-70 event. And he says it's pure eisegesis to start double fulfilling these things, giving them multiple fulfillments. But then when we get to the resurrection of Daniel 12, he wants to give it 2 different resurrections. Now, you did the same thing that I did, and I quoted out of his book on the Great Commission, where he just says, no, Daniel 12, this is one resurrection at the end of the age. And then the context there, he's critiquing premillennialists who have 2 different resurrections separated by 1,000 years.
Yep.
But now Gentry has 2 resurrections, one in a corporate body, spiritual resurrection in AD 70, and then one thousands and thousands of years away. Now, if it's wrong for the dispensationalists to give double fulfillments to the tribulation, abomination, desolation, Mr. Gentry, why on God's green earth are you allowed to give the resurrection, the appointed time, the one end there, to give it 2 ends and 2 appointed times?
Yeah.
It's pure pandering to the creedal base. That's all it is.
That's exactly right. And as I pointed out in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, Gentry particularly, and I honestly do not know Doug Wilson's position on the wedding. Do you? What does
he says all of Matthew 24 is fulfilled in AD 70.
Okay.
All right, so there's our wedding.
Yeah.
All the way up to Matthew 25 verse 31. Now, okay, and of course, Matthew 22, they're going to come from the east and the west. We discussed that last time. That's the resurrection of Isaiah 25, 6 through 9. The wedding feast there in the wedding. So Doug has this is why he won't debate us. I mean, he just has some serious problems because the wedding and the wedding feast is connected to the resurrection.
Yeah.
I mean,
and the coming of salvation, the parousia. What does he apply? Revelation 19, verse 6, at the judgment of Babylon, the great voice declares, let us be glad and rejoice, for the time of the wedding of the Lamb has come.
Yes. And, I would like to drill in on, at some point when we get to 1 Corinthians 15 and the swallowing up of death, when the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven to earth, death is no more.
Yeah.
That's the death of 1 Corinthians 15. So these guys have to create another already and not yet. They have an already not yet between AD 30 and AD 70, and then they create another already and not yet. Well, yeah, we're in the New Jerusalem, kind of, sort of, and there is no more spiritual curse of the death right now for us, kind of, sort of, but it's just an already and not yet. And of course, when you just throw out the already and not yet, that's a scholarly way of having everyone just ignore all of your contradictions.
Well, you're exactly right on that. Yeah. Okay. So back to Romans 8, maybe. we got a minute. Well, we got 1 minute left here, Mike. So Paul says that the sufferings of this present time, pathemata, are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be
about to be.
And that is mellow, which is about to be. Now, we've already pointed out, Mike's already pointed out, that Gary DeMar admitted in writing, whatever that glory is, he may not understand what that glory is, but it was about to be revealed. And by the way, let's be very clear about this. Gary DeMar didn't make that up. You can go to any number of major scholarly commentators, and they will tell you that is the proper rendering of Romans chapter 8 of verse 18.
Yeah, your literal translations, which Gentry told us we're supposed to follow on mellow, but backtracked on it.
Exactly right.
And like I said, Philip Kaiser, a guy who signed this letter condemning Gary, says that this is mellow. So
okay.
The redemption of the body had to have taken place.
Exactly. Well, folks, we're out of time. I knew we wouldn't get far because there were so many motifs we just had to discuss. Want to thank you for joining us. Now, what I'm going to do, I'll get this all processed. It'll be tomorrow before we can publish it. But as I announced on Monday of this week, I will repost this video on Thursday morning as my morning musing video. Okay, so it will actually be posted. Mike will post it in the places that he chooses. I will also post it in some different places, but I'll definitely post it Thursday morning as my morning musing video. But in the meantime, we want to thank everyone for watching, for your interest, and don't hesitate to contact Mike or me if you have some questions on these passages that we're going to cover, and you want us to cover some aspect of these passages that you think that we haven't covered, and we won't cover everything there is to be discovered in these texts. Nonetheless, Mike, great to be with you again. Had a lot of fun again. So good night.
Night.